Preface. Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by W.H.S. Jones. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by W.H.S. Jones, M.A., with an introduction by Major R. Ross, F.R.S., C.B., and concluding chapter by G.G. Elliott, M.B. Preface. This little book owes its beginning to the suggestions and encouragement of Mr. A. E. Shipley and Major Ross. Since there are few previous works on the same subject, a large amount of correspondence was necessary with authorities on ancient medicine, both British and continental. A great part of this was undertaken by Mr. Shipley, and to him are due my most grateful thanks. Among other specialists who have given generous help must be mentioned Dr. E. T. Withington, Professor Clifford Albert, and Professor E. V. Arnold. In addition to this, it seemed well to invite the direct cooperation of medical men. Mr. G. G. Elliott has added a chapter on malaria as a factor on morality, and Major Ross, besides supplying many notes, criticisms, and comments, has written an introduction. The object of the writers has been to show how important it is to stamp out malaria as soon as possible. Most other diseases, however, distressing to individuals, brace the people by weeding out the unfit. Malaria plays no such useful part in the economy of nature. It seizes all, fit and unfit alike, gradually lessening the general vitality until, in some cases, it has exterminated the people among whom it has become endemic. Very important evidence is cited in the additional notes on page 60 and 76. I hope that some readers will be encouraged to search for fresh evidence and to publish their conclusions. That hope is the only justification for publishing the present inquiry. W.H.S. Jones, Percy School, Cambridge. End of Preface. Section 1 of Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by William Henry Samuel Jones and Ronald Ross. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information on the volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 1 Introduction, by Ronald Ross, Professor of Tropical Medicine, University of Liverpool. The author of this very instructive and interesting little book has asked me to write a short introduction to it. I can only hope that my foreword will not prove incongruous to a work over which he has spent so much enthusiastic labour. A student of biology is often struck with the feeling that historians, when dealing with the rise and fall of nations, do not generally view the phenomena from a sufficiently high biological standpoint. To me, at least, they seem to attach too much importance to individual rulers and soldiers, and to particular wars, policies, religions, and customs, while at the same time they make little attempt to extract the fundamental cause of national success or failure. We may suspect that these are really more sociological than humanistic, that is, common to races of animals and of men, rather than peculiar to the latter. I see no reason to suppose that the rumen and the megatherium were not struck down by similar causes. There must be a great complex of causes which produces racial predominance and decay, a complex of still greater intricacy in the case of man. Possibly the causes of racial death may be classified under the same headings as those of individual death: physiological, pathological, and traumatic. For example, the individual man is built up from a single zygote, or a combined cell, by means of reiterated division, until ultimately his body is composed of billions of cells organized in different castes and professions, so that he is, in fact, himself a great nation of associated beings. Death may overtake this microcosmic nation, either, apparently, from exhaustion of the power of cellular reproduction, or from pathological destruction, poisoning, or paralysis of certain essential castes of cells, or from forcible disruption of the whole organization. Hypothetically, then, we might expect similar phenomena, in a race of animals or a tribe of men, decadence or death from exhaustion of the reproductive faculty from pathological necrobiosis of individuals, or from direct destruction by enemies. Since a conception, which can of course be enunciated here only in the briefest manner, will force itself especially on those who have had opportunities of knowing many races of mankind, what is it that causes the infinite diversity of type and of ability? Why, for example, in India, do we obtain under much the same conditions of race, climate, and government so many different types, from that of the brave and massive Sikhs to that of the timid and feeble inhabitants of many localities? Success in war must be rather a result than a cause. The wisdom of individual rulers can exert but a temporary effect. Doubtless, marriage customs, by the substitution of parental for sexual selection, must exert a bad effect on the eugenics of some races. Overcrowding may act by the greater facilities which it gives for the dissemination of parasitic diseases, by the production of poverty, or by some other and as yet unknown means. Vices, superstition, misgovernment, and finally intellectual decadence, like failure in war, are probably secondary to the original causes. Among the most potent of these, and yet strangely overlooked by historians, must be widespread disease. I do not mean epidemic infections such as plague and cholera, which sweep through a population for a time and then leave it, but those endemic diseases which, when once introduced, oppress it forever, particularly those which attack the children, kill many of them, and render a large percentage of the remainder sickly for years. I am aware that it has been argued that such maladies really enhance development by destroying the unfit and leaving finally a robust and immune race, but there is no evidence that they do really select or destroy the unfit in preference to the fit. While as regards to acquirement of racial immunity, this, if it really exists at all, must take thousands of years to be established. On the other hand, in the international struggle for existence or supremacy, a people of whom a large proportion have passed through a sickly childhood cannot but be at disadvantage compared with more healthy nations, and it is quite possible that the sudden introduction of an endemic disease among a people hitherto dominant in the world may end in its rapid downfall as regards science, arts, commerce, and war. It is believed, for instance, that many of the native races of America were destroyed after the discovery of the continent, not so much by the arms of the white men as by their diseases. I have heard that not so long ago a third of the Andamanese Islanders were swept away by measles. Whole populations have disappeared before smallpox and syphilis, and I suspect that tuberculosis has had a marked but as yet undetermined effect on the world's history. In warm climates, intestinal parasites, dysentery, and malaria probably have a most malign influence. I have long suspected that the extreme feebleness of many crowded Indian populations, in principally due to the common roundworm, which prevails to a shocking degree among both children and adults. I have seen whole villages and plantations persecuted by the blood-sucking ankylostoma, or actually destroyed by the parasite of Kala-Azar. Modern science has of course shown that disease is very largely nothing but parasitism or its results, but this fact has not yet penetrated sufficiently into our studies of history. Historians, in attributing the downfall of nations to human agencies, have overlooked the probably greater effects produced by these obscure or invisible foes which destroy us from within. It is this important theme applied to the downfall of the greatest of nations which Mr. Jones has studied from the historical point of view. The suggestion is that the conqueror of Greece was not so much the Macedonian or the Roman as that great tyrant which now holds half the world, Malaria. In order to understand his work, the reader should know the following facts about the disease. It is due to multitudes of minute animal parasites of the blood, which produce fever recurring every 1, 2, or 3 days, quotidian, tertian, or quartan fever. If not treated by cinchona, which was discovered only a few centuries ago, the parasites remain in the body for many years, causing frequent relapse of fever, anemia, and enlargement of the spleen. They are carried from man to man by the agency of a class of gnats called anophelines, which breed in small pools of water on the ground. Whereas such pools are numerous in the hot months of summer and autumn, and in marshy localities, the insects generally abound, and if a patient with the parasites in his blood enters the locality, they become infected by biting him and then pass the microbes on to any healthy persons they may feed upon subsequently. The disease may thus be spread slowly by the gnats from a single patient until it affects the whole country, and where it has once entered, it is passed on from generation to generation. Ceteris paribus, where there are the most suitable pools in the summer, there are most anophilines, and where there are most anophilines, there is the most malaria. Though qualifying circumstances exist, the valleys and flat waterlogged plains are generally the most malarious, the fact which gave rise to the synonym marsh fever. In the very malarious places, children frequently become infected after birth and remain infected until puberty, when the survivors acquire partial immunity. In many low-lying villages, almost every child contains the parasites and looks more or less wasted and pale, with greatly enlarged spleen and a dusky complexion. People who live on the surrounding hills, though these may be healthy enough, easily become infected when visiting the lower villages for marketing or agriculture. We have all heard of Mauritius, that earthly paradise which witnessed the sorrows of Paul and Virginia. But in 1866, malaria was introduced in some manner, and has caused infinite injury to the island ever since. So also in many localities the disease has crept from village to village, enfeebling and stupefying the inhabitants like cretinism. An intensely malarious locality cannot thrive. The children are wretched, the adults frequently racked with fever, and the whole place shunned whenever possible by the neighbours. The landowner, the traveller, the innkeeper, the trader fly from it. Gradually it becomes depopulated and untilled, the home only of the most wretched peasants. Turning now to Greece, we shall easily understand from a consideration of its topography how readily it must fall under the sway of malaria. Rugged and mountainous, the only inhabitable spots are a few small plains and valleys, that is, just those places where pools of water most suitable for anophilines are likely to be formed. True, the rainy season in Greece is the winter, when the insects do not breed, but still, even in the summer, the valleys are traversed by perennial fountains and streams which issue from the surrounding mountains, and which, while they make agriculture possible, at the same time tend to produce small marshes, often close to the villages. From these the insects can swarm into the houses, where they become infected by biting the inhabitants and so carry the infection from person to person for months, until almost everyone in the locality contains the germs of the disease. As is now known to a certainty, such is the actual method by which malaria is propagated. I suppose this subfamily of gnats must have been present in Greece from very remote prehistoric times, but it does not therefore follow that malaria also existed there from the same time. The gnats alone are not sufficient. They are only the carriers of the parasites, and these also must be introduced at some period or other before the disease can spread in a locality. It is quite possible that if ancient Greece was peopled by invaders coming from northern non-malarious latitudes, it might have had no malaria for ages, in spite of the presence of the anophilines, until some person with the parasites in his blood happened to visit the country. Then, if he was bitten by the insects, they would carry the infection to others in his neighbourhood, and from these to others further afield, until the disease would be gradually spread all over the country, just as had certainly occurred recently in Mauritius, and probably in many other lands besides these. For example, I think there is much reason for supposing that malaria was not always present in Italy, and that the Campagna, now so desolated by it, must have been healthy until quite up to this historic period. So also perhaps the divine valleys of Greece may have remained unsullied by this miasma, this pollution, until soldiers, merchants, or slaves coming from Africa or Asia, the ancient homes of malaria, introduced it. Once introduced, it must have spread from valley to valley with fearful effect upon the inhabitants. It would probably have seized first the most low-lying and fertile valleys, especially the cultivated outskirts of the cities, and have then spread into the upland villages, and even into the heart of some of the cities. Everywhere the children would be attacked, and would remain infected with pale complexions, emaciated frames, and enlarged spleens, until puberty, when a partial, but only partial, immunity might rescue the probably stunted bodies of the survivors from further illness. Gradually, the whole rural life of the affected area would be vitiated. The hardy peasantry and the vigorous soldiers would no longer be found. The rich would desert their villas, and the priests and rural shrines of the gods. Still further, supposing that at the same time, members of Africans and Asiatics had been poured into the country as slaves, these people already probably inured to malaria in their tropical homes would survive, while their fair-haired masters and masters' children would gradually tend to be eliminated, so that, after perhaps a century or two, the whole character of the population might gradually be changed. And I suspect this change would be much more fundamental than any which could be produced by temporary wars and invasions, because the same cause would tend to produce the same results from century to century, the fairer norther succumbing, where the more injured races of the south survive, just the opposite, in fact, non-malarious countries, where the more vigorous northerner tends to oust the southerner. Of course, on this hypothesis, we might expect the original races to survive better in the non-malarial islands of the archipelago, a thing which travellers aver has actually happened. Malaria has quite possibly produced similar results in southern Italy, but its effect on that country was probably less marked than its effect on Greece, because the ratio of malarious to non-malarious areas in the former seems to be much smaller than in the latter, where almost every valley can harbour it. Modern Greece is intensely malarious. In the Copaic Plain, examined by me last year, I estimated that quite half the children were infected, even in June before the annual malaria season had commenced. The Attic Plain is, and probably always was, much healthier owing to its dry climate, but numbers of other plains and valleys are certainly as bad as the one I studied. The Grecian Anti-Malaria League has collected excellent statistics on the subject, and these have been published by Drs. Savas, Kardomatis, and others. For instance, it has been estimated that in the unhealthy year 1905, out of a total population of only about 2.5 million, nearly 1 million people were attacked with malaria, and nearly 6,000 died. Blackwater fever, the worst form of malaria, is exceedingly common. I have never seen, even in India and Africa, villages more badly infected than Moloki and Skripal in the Copaic district. The Greek army is as heavily infected as was the Indian army until the last few years. Of course, we must not assume that an event actually did occur only because it may have occurred, but a priori, it seems likely that malaria was introduced into Greece about the time of the Greek invasions of Asia and Africa by slaves or by sick soldiers returning to their homes. It would require, say, half a century to obtain a firm hold of the country, and then would probably undermine that august civilization when at its height. Let us gaze for a moment at those magnificent marvels which have recorded forever the finest development of the human form. Were these gods and heroes born out of the imagination of a people infested and degraded by malaria? What trace or suggestion of that disease would the well-trained eye of the medical man detect either in them or in the less idealized figures on the tombstones? All these are evidently the creations of a large and healthy northern race, more akin to the Scandinavian race of today, at least so it appears to me, than to any other. I find it difficult to imagine that the people who produced this great sculpture, and the no less magnificent science and literature of ancient Greece, could have ever suffered very much from malaria. True, it may be said that the disease was present among them during the whole of the Great Age, but only to a slight degree. But this is difficult to understand, because the existence of even a few endemic cases would suffice, given the presence of the carrying agents, to produce a wide and rapid extension. Again, it may be argued that the malaria as seen in Greece today was not a cause, but a result, due to the neglect of cultivation caused by the devastation of wars. But here also I may say that I have seen no evidence of the hypothesis that uncultivated lands are really more malarious than cultivated ones. All cultivation requires water, and frequently requires artificial irrigation, while the mere occupancy of cultivated land by the peasantry tends to ensure the presence of the parasite, so that devastation should, and does, I think, reduce malaria instead of increasing it. On the whole, therefore, it seems probable that malaria would reach its present degree of prevalence increase very shortly after its introduction, and must have been the cause, or a cause, of the rapid decline of the country after the Great Age, and not the result of that event. The difficult task of seeking historical evidence in this connection has been aptly taken up by Mr. Jones, and I hope his work will not only be of interest to scholars, but will stimulate further research in a direction which has not been much followed. He suggests, moreover, that the story of malaria in Greece should be of importance to all malarious countries, and should help in that war, which is now being commenced against the disease in many places. In this war we must welcome every possible ally. End of section 1. Section 2 of Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by William Henry Samuel Jones and Ronald Ross et al. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain, recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 2. Malaria in Ancient Greece. A few years ago, the writer was investigating the change in the Greek character which took place during the 4th century BC. The following results seemed then, and still seem certain. There does not appear to have been an increase of immorality between, say, 500 to 300 BC, but nevertheless morality changed. Home life took precedence of city life. Patriotism decayed, and lofty aspirations almost ceased to stir the hearts of men. In art there appeared a tendency to sentimentalism. Philosophy in many quarters became distinctly pessimistic. Some schools of thought actually took absence of feeling or absence of care as the highest goal of human endeavour. Dissatisfaction and querulousness are marked characteristics of the age. By 300 BC, the Greeks had lost much of their manly vigour and intellectual strength. The cause of this change appeared to the present writer to be partially the decay of religious feeling and partially the growth of the human intelligence, which resulted in dissatisfaction with existing institutions. Doubtless both these tendencies were factors in the change, but they did not seem at the time of writing the earlier essay, and they do not seem now to be sufficient by themselves. The recent investigation into the prevalence of malaria in Greece and into its effects upon the inhabitants suggests that a similar agency may have been at work during the 4th century BC. Malaria, like influenza, differs from many other diseases in that it does not strengthen a people by weeding out the unfit. Its result is to produce a general lowering of vitality without bringing about a very large number of deaths. Malaria usually becomes chronic, at least until a comparative immunity has been gained. In such cases, despondency and nervous debility leave a permanent mark upon the victim. It should then be carefully noticed that, quite apart from the actual facts of the case, malaria would tend to produce those characteristics which have been mentioned above. Of course, malaria must have been prevalent to bring about any change in the character of a people. Now, the extent of the infection is another distinguishing mark of malaria. Recent statistics show that some 40% of the population of Greece have the disease. Immunity among adults may come after a while, but ere it be attained, the general health will be lowered. All children in some districts, many in others, pass through a childhood subject to a succession of weakening febrile attacks. 4 points must be discussed in the present inquiry. 1. Did malaria exist in Greece? 2. If so, to what extent was it prevalent? 3. When was it introduced, or when did it become common? 4. Is there any ancient evidence of its effect upon character? All these aspects of the question are important. Nevertheless, it must be noticed that the precise date of the introduction of malaria is by no means so vital a point as to determine the period when it became widely extended. It may have lurked in corners without doing much harm, but its prevalence would necessarily bring about a decline in vigour and a change of character. Means of identifying malaria. If care be taken, malaria is by no means a difficult disease to identify. A good test of its periodicity. Any febrile complaint with a definite tertane or quartane periodicity is certainly malarial. no other infection exhibits this type of periodicity. You may be sure then that a patient complaining of fever recurring every 48 or 72 hours, whatever else he may have, certainly has malarial disease. It does not, however, follow that a fever with a different periodicity is not malarial. A patient may be infected with both the tertane and the coartane parasite, or there may be cases of double infection, i.e., cases where the patient has been twice infected with the same kind of parasite, so as to bring about a new periodicity. For example, a quotidian fever may be the result of double tertian infection. It may then be safely concluded that a considerable number of quotidian fevers will be malarial. But in order to strengthen the case as much as possible, no stress will be laid upon quotidians in the present inquiry. Another excellent test is enlargement of the spleen. This is the test which was most used by Major Ross when he was investigating the prevalence of malaria in modern Greece. He calls it a fairly trustworthy one, provided that no other cause of splenomegaly be present. Once more, however, in order not to overestimate the evidence, it would be well to use splenic enlargement as a confirmatory test only. Symptoms of a malarial attack. The paroxysm is divided into 3 stages: the cold stage, the hot stage, and the sweating stage. 1. The attack begins with a feeling of weariness, headache, nausea, and vomiting. The patient begins to shiver, and there is a reduction of the skin temperature, combined frequently with internal fever. The pulse is quick, small, and hard. Urine is increased. 2. The second stage is marked by the heat and redness of the skin. The pulse is full and pounding. Delirium is sometimes present. Intense thirst is suffered. 3. The third stage is characterized by more or less sweating, followed by a cessation of fever or even by sleep. The first or third stage, or both, may be mild. The most common variation is the hot stage alone. The disease causes anemia and splenomegaly as after effects. It would not be surprising if the symptoms described by the ancient medical writers did not agree in all respects with those given above. Diseases have a way of changing more or less in degree and even in type, but it will be found that in this case the type has remained practically unchanged. Greek terms for fever. Before going on to inquire into the prevalence of malaria in ancient Greece, it will be necessary to discuss the equivalence of the English word fever. The most common general term is pyretos, derived from pyr, fire. It is properly used in the sense of heat in Iliad 22:31 of the Dog Star. Feri pola pyreto dielioi votoisin. Greek text is displayed on the page. The ancients seem to have taken the word to mean heat, as is plain from the Latin poets Virgil, Lucan, and Statius, who appear to have this line in mind when talking of the burning dog star. On the other hand, Aeschylus remarks that the word might mean fever as well as heat. It is a fact that the sense of fever does not fit the passage. Summer and autumn are the seasons when fever was most prevalent in Greece. It seems likely, however, to judge from the usage of later non-medical writers that either nosos or the plural would have been used if a disease had been meant. In any case, even if fever be the meaning here, it is not necessarily malaria. It might very well be typhoid. In the present inquiry, that meaning will be assumed to be true, which tells most against the writer's own theory. After this solitary instance in Homer, there is a large gap. Hesiod does not appear to use pyretos, although he might well have been expected to do so. The present writer cannot find that the word occurs again before Aristophanes. Herodotus does not use it, nor does Thucydides. It is remarkable that when the latter, in his description of the plague, wishes to express feverishness, he seems to avoid the word pyretos and uses instead kavma or thermi. On the other hand, when Galen is describing the same plague and is roughly quoting the word of Thucydides, he employs pyretos twice within a few lines. The places in Aristophanes where pyretos seems to occur for the first time after Homer are interesting. In the Wasps, date 422 BC, occurs the following passage. And he says that he attacked last year the shivers and fevers which by night strangled your fathers and throttled your grandsires, etc. A fuller explanation of these words will be given later. It is sufficient to notice here that from this time onwards, pyretos is a fairly common word, or the verb pyreso, first apparently in Europe, Circle 228, and Fericrates in Athens 375, I have an attack of fever also frequently occurs. In the Greek medical writings, which date from 400 BC onwards, pyretoi are divided into two classes, A. continuous, Thynechius, and B. intermittent, Dolepontes. The second class is again subdivided accordingly to periodicity, the simpler forms for which give 1. Quotidians, Aphiromenoi, 2. Tertians, Tritaioi, and 3. Quartans, Tertatoi. The first mention of this division, which is to be found in non-professional writings, occurs in the Timaeus of Plato. This passage is to the effect that a body produces 1. Continuous burnings, Synechi kavmata, and pyretoi when suffering from excessive fire, pyr. 2. Quotidian, pyretoi when suffering from excessive air. 3. Tertian, pyretoi when suffering from excessive water. 4. Pyretoi, quartan when suffering from excessive earth. In the most popular speech, then, there is a tendency to limit pyretoi to definite fevers, namely to those exhibiting a certain periodicity. It cannot be said that this tendency is present in the professional writers, though even there pyretoi usually means intermittence. A similar tendency is noticed in modern times, in districts where scarlatina is constantly prevalent. He has the fever will nearly always mean one thing. An ordinary person will not usually apply the expression to a typhoid patient. On the other hand, to a medical man, both typhoid and scarlatina would be fevers. The present discussion will be occupied with the intermittents, and in the next section their symptoms, as given by the ancient medical writers, will be fully described. In the meantime, two other names must receive attention. 1. Kaphos. This fever, the burning disease, is very clearly described by Hippocrates. The chief symptoms are bodily ache and lassitude, intense thirst, sleeplessness, and sometimes delirium. The tongue is rough, dry, and very black. There are gnawing pains about the bowels. The alivine discharges are watery and yellow. Major Ross says that this disease must be typhoid only, so that it will be neglected in the present inquiry. 2. Epialos. This curious word first occurs in Theognis. It is used twice by Aristophanes. Galen gives a brief account of the disease. It was a protracted quotidian, and of such a kind that the patient felt fever and shivering at one and at the same time and in every part of the body. He adds that some Attic writers use the word to denote the shivers which precede an attack of fever. Major Ross, who has given his opinion after examining such evidence as a present writer could put before him, inclines to the belief that epialos, the disease, was malaria or typhoid, though it might possibly be Malta fever. Of course, it is also possible that the disease was one which does not now exist. Did malaria exist in Greece? If tertian and quartan fevers existed among the Greeks, they certainly suffered from malaria, but it will be useful to apply the confirmatory test, splenomegaly, and to enter more fully into the symptoms and variations of the intermittent fevers which are described by the ancient medical writers. The evidence that enlargement of the spleen was common is copious, but practically confined to professional works. This is only to be expected, especially as the Greeks had the excellent sense not to talk overmuch about their ailments. In a curious passage of the Timaeus, Plato describes the spleen as a receptacle for the purgations of the liver, and accounts in this way for splenic enlargement. When it is remembered that the Greeks held that tertians and quartans were caused by bile, the words of Plato at once become full of meaning. Hippocrates says that men who drink marsh water get enlarged spleens. The phenomenon Hippocrates really observed was that dwellers in marshy places suffer from enlarged spleens. His interpretation of this phenomenon is incorrect. The enlargement was, in all probability, caused by malaria conveyed from one person to another by mosquitoes bred in the marshes. Splenic enlargement is also caused by typhoid, and it may be remarked in passing that there is a tendency among modern physicians to diagnose most of the fever cases described in the Hippocratic writings as some form of the disease. This may be correct. Malaria and typhoid are sometimes extremely difficult to distinguish in ancient writings, especially when the former is of a complicated type. But typhoid would not account for the many other fevers mentioned in the same writings which have a definite tertian or quartan periodicity. These must be malarial, and no one who reads the few passages about them which occur in the non-professional writings, or the accurate descriptions given by Hippocrates and Galen, will fail to come to the conclusion that they were among the commonest of the diseases with which the Greeks were afflicted. But the risk of confusing malaria and typhoid must make the historian cautious. Many fevers are described in the ancient writers which are, in all probability, though not certainly, some form of malaria. In the present inquiry, no stress will be laid upon these, in order that there may be a firm foundation of fact upon which to build. For these reasons, it seems desirable not to discuss at length the vast number of cases in which splenomegaly is mentioned in the old medical writers. It will be sufficient to state that in a great number of instances it is allied with other symptoms which evidently show that it was not caused by any disease so serious as typhoid. Pyamic fevers other than malaria may of course be meant, but the probability is that the latter disease is the one described. One or two examples must suffice. Hippocrates states that in autumn quartan fevers and splenic diseases are very common. The same writer says that bilious persons who have enlargement of the spleen are evil-complexioned, ulcerous, and emaciated, and suffer from foul breath and constipation. These are most certainly the symptoms of malaria. Cachexia. Malarial fevers in ancient medical writers. Major Ross has kindly forwarded the following particulars about malaria. There are 4 kinds of malaria parasites: quartan, mild tertian, malignant tertian, and quotidian. Quartan. Fever lasts on the average 9 hours and recurs every 3rd day. Mild tertian. Fever lasts 11 hours and recurs every other day. Malignant tertian. Fever lasts up to 40 hours, rises slowly, halts for hours, declines a little and then rises again to a greater height, and lastly falls, recurs every other day. Quotidian. Fever lasts 6 to 12 hours and comes on every day. But a quotidian fever may be produced by 1. 3 parallel generations of quartan parasites, or 2 generations of tertians, or 3 1 generation of quotidian parasites. There are also mixed infections due to different parasites together and double quartans. To discuss fully all the different accounts of quartans, tertians, and quotidians, as described in the Greek writers, would occupy a large treatise. It is certain, therefore, that they were continuously prevalent, and that they were more common diseases than other kinds of fevers. But it is not the object of the present inquiry to enter into details. The main point is to identify these fevers with malaria. The best description is to be found in Galen, who seems to have made a special study of periodicity. Although Galen is a later writer who lived in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century AD, there is no risk in accepting his evidence. His account agrees in all essentials with the testimony of older writers, and there is no evidence that Galen describes diseases unfamiliar to his predecessors. In the treatise Peritophon, Galen divides intermittents into 1. Quotidians with daily access, 2. Tertians with an access every other day, 3. Quartans with an access every 3rd day. Quintans, and even less frequently recurring fevers, are also mentioned. There is also distinct recognition, both in this treatise and in others, of mixed and double infections. One instance only shall be quoted here, In the book Peripteridon, he remarks that a fever with attacks recurring every day is liable to be diagnosed by the uninitiated as a quotidian. But if a man takes pains and have a genuine interest in medicine, he will not forget that the same effect can be produced by 2 tertians or 3 quartans. There was also a fever which he calls semi-tertian, which is regarded as a mixture of the tertian and continuous quotidian. It was a dangerous disease, attacked usually men in the prime of life, and especially in the autumn, and was marked by the length of the attack. There seems to have been much irregularity in the length and severity of the paroxysms. This fever was probably some variety of the tertian type, whether mild or malignant, produced by mixed or double infection. As an example of intermittent fevers, Galen gives a full account of the tertian. It begins with rigor and finishes with sweat and vomiting of bile. In some cases the intermission is short. Such fevers he calls protracted tertians, paractina nontes. Occasionally the fever lasts for 40 hours or even longer. To descend to details, tertian fevers begin with shivering and chill in the extremities. The pulse is hard and contracted. Gradually the chill is superseded by fever and the pulse becomes quicker and larger. The patient often feels internal fever while the limbs are still chilled. The fever gradually increases until it has spread over the whole body. Then it subsides little by little, the decrease being usually tois plestos, accompanied by sweating. The references in the Hippocratic writings to tertians are very numerous, and nothing would be gained by quoting them in full. The same applies to quartans. Special mention, however, may be made of the passage in the first book of the Epidemics, where, among other interesting remarks, it is stated that the quartan is the longest but least severe type of intermittence, while the semi-tertian is the most deadly. From other medical writers are quoted below 2 passages of Audiobooks, dealing with tertians and quartans respectively. For reasons given above, no further stress is laid upon quotidians. Extent of the prevalence of malaria. The preceding section has not only shown that malaria existed in ancient Greece, it has also proved it to be widely prevalent. Even if all fevers except tertians and quartans be disregarded, these are mentioned so frequently, and by such a diversity of writers as to leave no doubt whatsoever. From the year 400 BC onwards, there is a vast quantity of evidence which points to the unmistakable conclusion that Greece was constantly in the clutches of an insidious and demoralizing foe. Plato, Aristotle, the Hippocratic writings, the long line of evidence represented by the works of Galen and Audiobooks all tell the same story. There is even a reference in an inscription. That reference to tertians and quartans do not occur more frequently in non-professional literature is not surprising. The Greeks were not in the habit of talking about their ailments. At any rate, when occasion arose to mention a fever, it would rarely be necessary to distinguish one kind from another, Trophos from Amphiromenos, and so forth. Especially would this be the case if the various forms of malaria were so common as to be designated in the popular speech by paratoi, without further qualification. Though medical writers do not observe such a limitation, there is some evidence that the people did, as a general rule, limit paratoi to malaria. Thucydides seems particularly careful to avoid the word peritos in describing the feverish symptoms of the plague. The words he uses are kavma and fermi. Plato also speaks of xeniche, kavmata, and probably applies the term paratoi to continuous fevers because he conceived them to be due to an excess of pyr. The use of kavma by Plato and Thucydides is a remarkable coincidence. Unfortunately, there is not sufficient evidence to warrant a positive conclusion, but nevertheless, the frequent mention of malaria in the medical writers, combined with the remarkable passage from the Timaeus, makes it extremely likely that malaria was often called in the popular speech by the simple name of fever. If this be so, whenever the words peritos, periso occur in non-medical writers, there is a strong presumption that malaria is meant. In any case, no doubt whatever can be entertained of its wide extension. Owing to the incompleteness of the evidence, due entirely to the fact that few Greek states have left us any literature, it is impossible to say for certain how far malaria spread. Attica was certainly attacked, as it is attacked now, and of course it was prevalent in the districts which came under the observation of the medical writers. It is clear from the Hippocratic treatises on airs, waters, and places that 1. The writer had been able to collect evidence about malaria from many districts. 2. The most he could say was that certain districts were less liable to malaria than others. Without going to the extreme of saying that no district was immune, there is every reason for supposing that malaria was widely spread. When was malaria introduced? Up to the present inquiry has had a firm foundation of indisputable facts. It is easy to prove that malaria was present in Greece. It is difficult to find out when it first made its appearance, or when it became endemic. It is proverbially hard to prove a negative statement, and the present writer readily admits that it is impossible to show that there was no malaria in Greece before a fixed date. This does not mean that there is no evidence. On the contrary, the evidence with respect to Attica at least is very strong, but it is cumulative, and depends for its full force upon a due consideration of many lines of indirect testimony. In the first place, there is no reference to any disease which can be malaria, with two exceptions, before the middle of the 5th century. The first exemption is Preface, in Iliad 22:31. Now it has been pointed out that here the word may mean heat merely, but in any case it is not necessarily malaria. But let it be taken for granted that the word does refer to malaria. It only shows that the disease was common in Homeric times and a place where the poet lived. This is probably Asia Minor. On the other hand, Hesiod, a poet of Boeotia, which is a land especially suited for the growth of the malarial mosquito, never uses the word Preface, even though he might well have been expected to do so. The whole question is uncertain, but whichever interpretation of Preface in Homer be accepted, nothing whatever can be proved as to the existence, or rather the prevalence, of malaria in those parts of the Greek world with which we are chiefly concerned. The other reference to a disease which may be malaria is the word epialos in Theognis 1:174. Here again no conclusive result can be reached. The disease which went by this name is so vaguely described by letter writers that modern experts cannot diagnose it with any certainty. Major Ross suggests typhoid, or malaria, or Malta fever. Surely very little can be made out of this single passage, even though malaria be the disease intended, for at most it does not prove that the disease was common, and does not show in the least that it was prevalent, or even that it existed in Attica. And it is with Attica that the present inquiry is most concerned. It is possible that malaria did exist in parts of Greece, both Greece proper and Greater Greece, from fairly early times. The fact that so large a portion of Greece never reached eminence may be due to the presence of a scourge which seems to blight the energies of its victims. But Attica, with its dry climate, would be late in becoming badly infected. If this be so, and it must be remembered that it is surmise only, a few words may be said about the possible fountainhead of the disease. Malaria is an African disorder, and the intercourse emergence may have carried it from Egypt to Greece, either directly or by way of Asia. A curious side light is thrown upon the question by a passage in which Herodotus describes the marsh dwellers of Egypt. They are, he says, much troubled by gnats, conobs. To afford protection from the bite of these insects, every man, pas anir, wraps himself up at night in the net, amphivistron, with which he has fished during the day. It is very likely that this region was a plague spot from which malaria spread to Greece and elsewhere. The Athenians who took part in the disastrous expedition to Egypt, 456 BC, may have become infected and brought back the disease to Attica. It would not necessarily spread with any great rapidity until conditions were favourable, as soon to be seen later. The most favourable conditions occurred during the last 20 years of the 5th century. The last few paragraphs have necessarily been little better than guesswork, and it is time to turn to the facts. It is in the Wasps of Aristophanes, 422 BC, that the word Preface first occurs in Greek literature, with the single exception of the Iliad 22:31. The passage is a striking one. Last year, says the poet, I attacked the Epialot, and the fevers which were throttling your fathers by night and strangling your grandsires. The language is, of course, figurative, and refers to the attacks of Aristophanes upon Psychophantae. But obviously the passage gains in point if Athens had recently been visited by an outbreak of fevers which were preceded by shivering. Now in the year 425, the Athenians had been busily engaged on the island of Sophacteria, but it is at least a remarkable coincidence that at the present day Sophacteria is one of the worst malaria centres in the Mediterranean. If it be true that malaria visited Attica about this time in the form of an epidemic, there is every reason to suppose that it would stay, and, in course of time, become endemic, for the land offered favourable conditions. Disease is an invariable accompaniment of war, and the Peloponnesian War was no exception to the general rule. But with regard to Attica during this war, there were certain circumstances which are rather peculiar, while they have a direct bearing upon the present question. The small farmers of Attica were compelled to leave their farms and live in Athens, the Piraeus, or even between the long walls which connected the port with the upper city. The land was no longer cultivated to any extent, because the yearly incursions of the Peloponnesians prevented the ingathering of the crops. The necessary supplies of food were imported from abroad, the powerful Athenian navy making it possible to feed the people in this manner. In course of time, cultivation of the soil must have come to a complete standstill, for in the year 413, Decelia was permanently garrisoned by the Lacedaemonians, and Attica became practically a waste. But to allow land which has been under cultivation to lie untilled and undrained is to offer the most unfavourable conditions to malaria. A few infected persons are enough to set the parasites breeding in the mosquitoes which hatch out from stagnant pools of the wasteland, and then these insects begin to do their deadly work. It is certain that had there been infected persons in Attica during the Decelean War, malaria would have become endemic. It may be noticed in passing that a precisely similar condition of affairs obtained in Italy during the Hannibalic War, 218 to 204 BC. Vast tracts of land must have been neglected and apparently left untilled for many years, for in the next century pasture land was largely superseded ploughed land. It is to say the least likely that the malaria parasites introduced from infected quarters of Italy by Greek slaves perhaps, or even by the Carthaginians themselves, spread gradually over the country, and helped to produce the decline which historians have traced during the 2nd century BC. There is other evidence that malaria was, during the 4th century BC, a disease but recently endemic in Attica. It seems to have attacked chiefly adults, for Galen, in the 8th book of his treatise on Hippocrates and Plato, blames the philosopher because he does not classify diseases according to the ages which are most subject to them. In the passage from Hippocrates, quoted from Galen, Pyretoi are included among the diseases to which childhood is especially liable. This may mean that Hippocrates was acquainted with regions in which children were attacked by malaria, but older people were particularly immune, while Attica, in which Plato lived, was recently infected. It is extremely difficult, except in marked cases, for any one but a modern specialist to diagnose malaria in young people, so that it is quite natural that Hippocrates speaks of Pyretoi without further qualification. Major Ross informs the present writer that in modern Greece young children are subject to a series of attacks up to the 15th year, and that then they become partially immune. He is inclined to think that if the disease occurred very commonly among older people, it probably had been recently introduced. On the other hand, malaria is not nearly so marked in children as in adults. The important point of notice is that it would have been difficult for Hippocrates to diagnose malaria in children, although he could have told they were suffering from fever. How malaria spreads. As is well known, the malaria parasites infect a certain genus, Anopheles, of mosquitoes, which in turn infect man. Thus, malaria cannot enter a country unless both factors be present, even though conditions be favourable. A striking instance of this fact is afforded by the islands of Mauritius, which, up to the early 60s, was a health resort for Anglo-Indians, although malaria parasites must have been constantly brought in by malaria patients. But in an unlucky hour, the Anopheles mosquito crept in, an epidemic followed, and now malaria is endemic in the island. Sir P. Mason gives a vivid account of the way in which malaria may attack a village community. Imagine, he says, some district in which Anopheles mosquitoes abound, but which is luckily free from malaria. A stranger with parasites in his blood comes to the village and is bitten by the local mosquitoes, which thus become both infected and infective. The disease spreads rapidly and is at first severe. After some years, the survivors become immune, or partially so, but the children become infected soon after birth and continue to be diseased for some years, gradually becoming immune. This is a condition of every village in every highly malarious district. The adults are immune, the children are nearly all of them full of malaria parasites. In a less highly malarious district, the adults are not always immune. In ancient Greece, malaria certainly attacked adults. Malaria was not then a highly malarious district. The prevalence of disease among older persons may be a sign that the infection of the country is recent, and this explanation, which is certainly a possible one, must not be overlooked. There is a most important passage in the Hippocratic Treatise on the Nature of Man, which bears very closely upon this point. The author is discussing at some length Paretos, Sinotkos, Ampheromenos, Treteios, and Tetartarios. He speaks for the origin of the Cortan in the black bile, remarks that it is much longer than the tertian, and that the age most subject to it is the 25th year to the 45th year. He does not say anything about the ages subject to quotidians and tertians, and he does not say that young people were not attacked by quartans. On the other hand, Hippocrates does not say that children were attacked by the paratoi, and many of these, at least, must have been malaria. The inferences which it seems fair to draw are as follows. 1. The districts which fall under the observation of the Hippocratic school were infected with malaria. Either they were not subject to it, so as to be, in the words of Sir Patrick Manson, highly infected, or more probably, they had but recently been overrun by the disease. 2. If this be so, Galen's criticism of Plato referred to be in the last section may mean that Attica had become infected even more recently. 3. Immunity and comparative immunity did not escape the notice of the ancient doctors. The Hippocratic author states plainly that if quartans occurred during the given period, 25 to 45, the attack was slight. In modern medical language, after 45 a man became partially immune. Before 25 the disease did not assume a marked form. 4. The silence of the Hippocratic author upon tertians and quotidians suggests that in young persons malaria was usually tertian or quotidian, or at least that it appeared to be of these types. See Galen quoted on page 60. Effect of malaria upon the Greek character. Before any attempt is made to treat this question from the modern scientific standpoint, it will be interesting to inquire whether the Greeks themselves ever traced psychological states to the influence of malaria. The word melancholia, with its cognates melancholikos and melancholo, occur for the first time in Greek literature very soon after the word pyretos becomes common, page 22. Melancholo is used by Aristophanes in The Birds, 415 BC, and in the Plutus. Plato uses the word melancholikos in conjunction with methostikos and erotikos to characterize the tyrant. The last reference shows that the meaning of the words has little to do with what we call melancholy. Burnet, in his note on Aristotle's Ethics, 1150b, translates melancholikos, excitable, hot-headed. It goes on to say that in Aristophanes, melancholan means to be crazy, and that the modern word which approaches nearest to the meaning of melancholikos in Aristotle is nervous. Now the derivation of these words is obvious. The melancholikos is the man who is inflicted with malaria coli. Furthermore, in the medical writers, tertian fevers are said to be caused by yellow bile, and quartan fevers by black bile. Of the many references which could be given, Oribasius 6:12 may be taken as typical. Quartan fever, says the passage, has its genesis in Melania coli. In other words, the Greeks, with their usual acuteness, noticed that malaria made a patient neurotic, and when they said that a man was melancholikos, they meant, when the word was first employed, that he was like one who had had malaria. If this association be kept in mind, many passages, especially in the medical writers, become full of new meaning. Large spleens are caused by excess of the melancholy humour, says Galen. Even more striking is the aphorism of Hippocrates, that long-continued fear and depression are a sign of melancholy, i.e. malarial cachexia. In another place, the same writer says that in autumn, the malarial season, occur cases of melancholy, and so on of the most striking symptoms of malaria, and of the anemia which follows it. It is said by modern observers to be nervousness, resulting in crossing of temper and mental depression. In short, the three cognates, melancholia, melancholikos, and melancholo, showed that malaria was common, that it was supposed to influence the character, and incidentally, that it probably became endemic during the last quarter of the 5th century, and it must be carefully remembered that the main point to prove is not when malaria was first introduced, but when it first took a firm hold of the inhabitants. Since the bilious complexion which suggested the term melancholia is a more obvious symptom than splenic enlargement, it is not unnatural that the former, rather than the latter, gave a new word to the Greek language. Nevertheless, the works of the medical writers do suggest that spleen and its derivatives hovered on the verge of becoming part and parcel of the popular speech. It is interesting to note that we still call a hot-tempered person splenetic, although the derivation is seldom present to the consciousness. In any case, the way in which spleens, splenio, and the like are employed suggests that enlargement of the spleen was a very common ailment. The utmost caution is necessary in connecting the change in the Greek character with the increase of malaria. In the first place, a royal battle has been waged over the question whether the Greeks did decline in morality during the 4th century. The fact that such a heated discussion has taken place is sure proof that the problem is intricate. It is equally sure proof that some change at least was in progress. But it must be remembered that even if decline is not very obvious by the year 300, it is so a few years later, and there is no reason for supposing that a treacherous disease like malaria, which moreover shows itself in a series of slight attacks, would produce striking results all at once. Its effect is rather a gradual but sure weakening of a people's powers. However, the present writer is convinced that the effects of malaria are quite discernible even before the year 300. The change during the 4th century is just that which malaria would produce. When making a special study of Greek morality some years ago, the present writer could not find that immorality grew during the century under discussion. On the contrary, the moral sense seems to have developed and become more sensitive. The terms conscience and duty receive a fuller and deeper meaning. The people certainly become more humane. On the other hand, they lost much of their brilliancy. Patriotism was still an honoured virtue in Athens, but her citizens no longer showed the initiative, spirit, or determination without which patriotism is but a hollow name. Pessimism in philosophy, sentimentalism in literature, morbid brooding over death, an inevitable contingency which in the great age was acceptable with a noble resignation, complete the picture of the change. The above conclusions were reached by one who had not yet entertained the idea that malaria existed in ancient Greece, and so attributed the phenomena to psychological causes. Of course, it is not pretended that malaria was the only factor in the change. The Greek outgrew his small city-state, and became discontented with his institutions. He lost not indeed his religion, but his living religious faith. History shows conclusively that without such faith no nation can survive for long. The means of gratifying luxurious tastes were afforded by a highly developed mercantile system. It may be that the unnatural vice in which the Greeks habitually indulged, to an extent which seems almost incredible, sapped their powers and energies. And finally, the suicidal Peloponnesian War, with the deadly plague which smote Athens, must have produced weakness and hastened decay. But the effect of all these forces would be increased if there were present a more insidious enemy, weakening the nerves and rendering its victims more likely to succumb to the disintegrating influences of their environment. Let due weight be given to the usually accepted causes of the decline of the Greeks, but two factors must never be forgotten. 1. Malaria was prevalent, apparently increasingly prevalent during the 4th century. 2. The effect of malaria is always disastrous. As one reads the terrible accounts given by those who have made a special study of the disease, the conclusion is forced upon the mind that no nation deeply infected with malaria could have achieved the triumphs of the 5th century, and that its certain prevalence in the 4th century must have caused a decline. Major Ross writes to say that the disease affects all young children and remains in them until about the age of 15, when they become partially immunized. It causes intermittent and remittent fever with enlargement of spleen and anemia, which makes the patient thoroughly ill with the accompanying loss of temper and perhaps of character. He adds that in adults the effects are more marked still, and that when children are affected they either die or in recovery show few symptoms which can be recognized by the ignorant populace. Incidentally, this latter remark shows how malaria may have been far more prevalent in ancient Greece than the extant evidence can possibly prove. At the present day, there are nearly 1 million people in Greece, out of a population of some 2,500,000 who are infected with malaria. All these have been weakened physically and intellectually by attacks which usually recur again and again. Statistics are available only because modern science has such perfect means of diagnosis. In ancient times, the majority of cases would have passed unnoticed. Who can say that ancient Greece was not equally plague-stricken? But you notice that owing to the imperfect state of the science of medicine, it was impossible that testimony should be transmitted to us. So surely it is a just inference that Greece must have been affected far more than can be proved. In the present inquiry, stress has been laid only upon those diseases which were undoubtedly malaria. There is, however, a vast amount of evidence which has been purposely suppressed. Page after page of the medical writers is devoted to diseases which may have been, nay, almost certainly were, malarial. The probability that symptoms of malaria are combined with those of typhoid makes all such evidence treacherous. It seems better to disregard it altogether, so as not to introduce into the inquiry more doubt than is absolutely necessary. Many attacks of malaria are mild in character. The Greeks themselves observed that quartans were generally not severe. This fact explains why we have no definite mention in ancient writers of a time when it first came, or when it first assumed endemic form. Many a Greek must have been smitten with malaria without feeling any symptom other than those he could express by the term pereso. But the permanent influence of malaria is not to be estimated by its mildness. A severe epidemic, such as one of smallpox, creates much stir at the time and causes many deaths, but does not last long, and its victims are comparatively few. In all probability, such endemics do not lower the physical efficiency of a people. Even endemic diseases like measles, which cause such trouble to modern children, are transient, and in the great majority of cases do not permanently injure their health. But with malaria, the case is different. Often not at all severe, it recurs again and again. Childhood may be one long sickness, the effects of which the adult carries to his grave. His faculties are dulled, and he is less efficient generally. Experience proves that if malaria be epidemic among a people, there must be a decline, physical, intellectual, and moral. Conclusion. Malaria was certainly prevalent in many parts of Greece, including Attica, during the 4th century BC, though Greece was not highly infected, in the technical sense of the word, as used by Sir Patrick Manson. The evidence of language and the fact that older people were frequently attacked suggests that the disease has been but recently introduced. The use of the word melancholia and its cognates shows that the Greeks themselves noticed the effect of malaria upon a character. The change which gradually came over the Greek character from 400 BC onwards was one which would certainly have been aided, and was in all probability at least partially caused by the same disease. The evidence given in the preceding pages is, from the nature of the case, chiefly cumulative. Many, but certainly not all, of the arguments brought forward might be attacked by a clever opponent. But taken together, they are very strong, and it must not be forgotten that a vast amount of testimony, far exceeding that which has been offered, might have been cited if the writer had not wished to exclude, as far as possible, all cases and symptoms which might imply either malaria or disease of the typhoid type. It is probable that many, it is certain, that some of these were malaria. All this should be borne in mind in passing a judgment upon the question. If anyone is still in doubt as to the devastating effect of malaria upon a character, he should consult a specialist in tropical diseases, or have a few words with one who has himself suffered from the disease. his doubts will then vanish. Skepticism on the point is only possible in a land in which, happily, malaria is no longer prevalent. End of section 2. Section 3 of Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome by William Henry Samuel Jones and Ronald Ross et al. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 3. Malaria in Ancient Italy. The introduction of malaria into Italy is a more complicated question than its introduction into Greece. The disease spread more slowly because the natural features of Italy, except in a few parts, are not so adapted to the growth of the mosquito. The effect upon the national character was not so profound as in the case of Greece, the most noticeable change being the evolution of savage brutality from sternness or cruelty. Unfortunately also, the earliest evidence of the existence of malaria is supported by no contemporary medical terminology. In Greek literature, the Hippocratic writings belong to the same epoch as the early allusions to malaria in non-medical authors, but the first Roman physician to leave us a treatise is Celsus, 50 AD, and malaria certainly existed in Italy long before that date. On the other hand, the modern inquirer is greatly helped by the many works on Italian malaria which have appeared within the last 40 years. In spite of the fact that the majority of these were written before the final demonstration of the mosquito theory, and that many are hopelessly confusing because it is not very long since true malaria was sharply distinguished from a number of other diseases which used to be called by the same name. The writers have collected and classified much of the ancient evidence. The reader will find North's Roman fever extremely useful in this respect. Whenever it was that malaria appeared in Italy, and whatever be the period when it became endemic, it is quite certain that the numerous cases of pestilence referred to in early Roman history were not malarial. The writer reached this conclusion independently, but the words of North are well worth quoting. Some recent writers on the subject would have us believe that many of the great pestilences of which we have record were malarial. There is, however, but slight justification for this view. For the most part, they followed upon wars and times of scarcity. The mortality as a rule was great, and the disease communicable from one individual to another. More than this, it is recorded in many cases that the cattle suffered as much as human beings, if not more. Altogether, in the absence of all proof to the contrary, it would seem more just to assume that these visitations were not malarial, but rather to the nature of malignant typhus, or plague, so called. At any rate, there is no proof whatsoever that they were malarial, and not only so, but it is highly improbable that such was the case. For as far as our experience goes, epidemic malaria of a grave type is chiefly confined to the tropics, and even there it is not common. It is likely enough that the worship of Febris as a goddess at Rome has reference to these pestilential epidemics rather than to malaria. This conclusion is supported by the inscription which is quoted in all the lexica: Febri Divae, Febri Sanctae, Febri Magnae, Camilla Profilo Amato. The epithet Magnae may of course mean simply mighty, but it is possible that it has reference to the distinction condemned by Galen as unscientific between great and small fevers, the former being in most cases typhus or enteric. It is not surprising that we find but few references to malaria in early Roman writers. The disease spreads in an insidious manner and is often unnoticed until it has a firm hold on a district. Fortunately, however, evidence is not wanting that malaria made its appearance and perhaps became common about the year 200 BC. If this be so, the facts usually cited to prove the prevalence of malaria in ancient times, the hill-built cities, the thick woolen toga, the carefully preserved fire in the temple of Vesta, must receive another interpretation. It is so easy to explain them in other ways that they would certainly not have been brought forward if better testimony were forthcoming. Perhaps the earliest reference to malaria occurs in the comedian Plautus, died 184 BC. Curcurio 1 I-17. Carutne febris tieri vel nubris tertius. Did a fever leave you yesterday or the day before? This is certainly not a definite allusion, but the line becomes most full of meaning if the reference be to an intermittent. Terence, died 159 BC, uses more explicit language in Hecuria 3:2-22. So, quid morbi est? Pam febris. So, quotidiana? Pam ita ont. So, what kind of disease is it? Pam, fever. So, quotidian? Pam, so they say. This line is unintelligible unless it be assumed that the writer was acquainted with periodic fevers other than quotidians. It may be objected that Plautus and Terence, who imitated Greek comedy, are here copying their originals so closely that no inference as to the existence of intermittents in Italy may fairly be drawn. It might be replied to this that in all probability both writers would have avoided references which were unintelligible to their audience. But it so happens that other testimony confirms the impression given by the comedians that the Romans of this period had some personal experience of malaria. The famous censor M. Porcius Cato, died 149 BC, has left a treatise on agriculture, De Re Rustica. North refers to two passages in this book, but is not disposed to believe that they point to malaria. The first occurs in chapter 1, where Cato advises him who would purchase a farm to see it that it be loco salubri, and that it have bonum celum. Again in chapter 141, there is a prayer to Mars that he may keep away morbos visos invisosque. Vague as these allusions are, a flood of light is thrown upon them by another passage to which North does not refer. This occurs in chapter 142. Et si atrabilis est et si leens tudient. In case of black bile and swollen spleen. The conjunction of a large spleen and black bile, as has been shown in the discussion on Greek malaria, is almost proof positive that Cato knew the symptoms of malaria, cachexia, and makes it more probable that malaria is referred to it in the passages quoted above. From Cato to Cicero, 106 to 43 BC, is a long interval, and one which has left us but a few fragments of literature. It may, however, be noticed that the Q. Fabius Maximus, who was consul in BC 121, suffered from malaria, if we may trust the story told by the older Pliny. But in Cicero is found frequent mention of tertians and quartans, and his contemporary Varro, 118 to 29 BC, declares that in marshy places crescunt animalia quaedam mintua, quae non possunt oculi consequi, and that these minute creatures entering the body by the mouth and nostrils produce difficiles morbos. From the time of Cicero, most writers mention malaria in unmistakable language, and it certainly had become, by the Christian era, a disease which the Romans were perfectly familiar. The physician Celsius, FL 50 AD, almost confines his discussion of fevers to the intermittents, so that in his book febris is practically equivalent to malaria. An opponent will perhaps inquire why it is inferred that malaria did not exist in Italy much before 200 BC. As in the case of Greece, so in this case also, it is impossible to prove that there was no malaria in early times, but it is most improbable that disease was endemic, and there is none but the flimsiest testimony that it was there at all. The following points have been urged. 1. The epidemics of fever in early times and the worship of febris. 2. The woolen toga, the fire vesta, and the hill-built cities. Now there is absolutely no reason for thinking the early epidemics to have been malarial. Periodicity and enlarged spleens are not mentioned in connection with them. The same remark applies to the morbus somnicus of the 12 tables, and to the leus of the Arvolium. The other arguments are equally thin. The fire in the temple of Vesta was kept alight, owing to the custom common among primitive peoples of never letting the hearth die out. The reasons for this are purely utilitarian, and will be more obvious to us if we do not possess lucifer matches. Cities were in ancient times built on hills, not only because mountain air is more healthy, even in a non-malarious country, but also because they were more easily defended against an enemy. The argument from the use of the heavy woolen toga is a little stronger. Such a garment is undoubtedly a protection against mosquito bites, as the insect cannot pierce thick woolen stuff. But it is at least very strange that the hygienic value of the toga was not a matter of tradition, and that its use gradually diminished even when malaria was, by universal consent, a fairly common disease. Surely the shape and quality of the toga were due to its being the best garment that could be designed to meet all emergencies. In the earliest times it was, with the exception of the sublic gaculium, the only garment worn by both rich and poor. That it would have afforded protection against malaria had it existed is an accident. The arguments which have just been attacked would have had some weight had there been independent evidence of malaria in early times. In the absence of that evidence, they are of no value at all. There is then every reason for supposing that malaria was unknown in early times, was well known at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, and that was gradually became more common during the next 200 years. If this be so, it is at least a plausible conjecture that it was introduced by Hannibal's Carthaginian mercenaries. Africa seemed to have been the original home of the disease, and it is probable that some of his troops were infected. The constantly repeated devastation of Italy in the Second Punic War would be sure to turn a large part of it into marshy land, thus affording a convenient breeding place to the mosquitoes which were infected by the malaria patients among the Carthaginians. The similar condition of Attica during the closing years of the 5th century BC offers a striking parallel. This opinion does not rest on mere conjecture. We are told by Livy that in the year 208 a severe epidemic attacked Italy. It did not cause many deaths, but resulted in much lingering disease, that is, most probably, chronic malaria. Where was malaria most prevalent? The existence and even the prevalence of malaria in Italy from 50 BC is an undisputed fact, and there is no need to prove what is universally admitted. But it will be useful to show that it was common, not only in certain country districts, but in Rome itself. Malaria in Rome. The evidence for the existence of malaria in the city is copious, and of different kinds. Galen, FL 164 AD, distinctly states that the most virulent form of it, the semi-tertian, was of everyday occurrence in Rome. The physician Celsus, 50 AD, says nothing to lead the reader to suppose that Rome was less frequently visited than the country districts. Martial, died 102 AD, bids the schoolmaster close his school in summer because estet pueri si valent satis discant. Juvenal, died 130 AD, refers to a sick old man as a quartan fever, and Horace tells of a mother who promises Jupiter that her son shall stand naked in the Tiber on the day his quartan leaves him. The works of Horace are by themselves sufficient to prove that in his time, he died BC 8, malaria was endemic in Rome, and incidentally that many country districts were free from the disease. It will be worthwhile to quote the chief passage in full. In Odes 2:14 occurs the stanza, Frustra sorrento Marte carabimas, fractisque Russi fractubis hydriae, frusta per octomons nocentum, corporbius metimus astrum. Auster brought in the autumn rains, and so helped to produce the malarial season. Even more appropriate is a passage in Satires 2:6-16, Fall, where the poet says that on his highland estate he need not fear the unhealthy autumn, during which the goddess of death reaps a richer harvest in Rome. Ergo ubi me in mons, et in arceam ex ubre removi, qui pria silistrium satires mussaque pedestri, nec mela mi ambitio perdit, nec plumbius astur. Actamasque gravis, libitinae questes acerbae. In fact, it seems to have been not unusual for those who could afford it to leave Rome during the unhealthy season. So we find Horace advising his friend and patron Aquinas to leave Rome in July. Here and there, as in the 9th satire of Juvenal, where the poet seems to be poking fun at an old man attacked by a quartan, it is clear that the young were among the chief victims. Another instance occurs in Horace, Satires 2-3, which has been quoted above. It is not then just possible that, although alumni in Odes 3:23 refers primarily to the young of the flocks, there may be also a reminder of the fact that darling children had every reason to fear this sickly season when the year brings forth fruit. Nec pestilentium sentient Africum, fecunda vertis nec sterilium sedes, robigenium aut dulces alumni, pomifero grave tempus anno. The most pertinent passage of all is Epistles 1:7, 5-9, where Horace says that all parents fear for their children in autumn. Dum ficus prima colorica, dissengentorium decorat laboribus artis. Dum puris omnis pater et matricula pellet, officioasque sedutilites et opella forensis. Adducit febris et testamenta resignat. Martial, too, has been pointed out already, believed that boys learned enough in summer if they kept well. All this evidence points to the conclusion that malaria had been long endemic in Rome itself, since on its first introduction the sufferers who attract most notice are the adults. Modern Rome, on the contrary, is comparatively free from malaria, although of course the immediate neighbourhood is highly infected. How has this striking change come about? Improved sanitation has nothing to do with the question, for malaria is not a filth disease. The modern ghetto at Rome, although it was the foulest quarter of the city, was nevertheless even less infected with malaria than other quarters. The case was probably to be found in the form of the atrium, the hole in the centre of the roof, which let out the smoke from the fire, also let in the rain, and this collected in the small cistern underneath. Compulivum impullivium. Each Roman house contained a pool of stagnant water admirably adapted to serve as a breeding ground for the mosquito. Another cause was the Tiber, with its frequent inundations. These gave much trouble. See Tacitus Annals 1:76, Histories 1:86, Suetonius, Div. Org. 30, Otho 8. The banks of the river were unhealthy. Tacitus, Histories 2:93. Adiacentur Tiber Germonarium, Golormag, obnoxia morbis corpa, fluminis, avidides et estis impactentia lepferex. Malaria in the rest of Italy. The prevalence of malaria in Rome will prove of importance when we discuss the influence of malaria upon the national character. But it is time to turn to the other part of the question and to inquire whether the country districts were also afflicted. A large area seems to have been untouched. The words of Horace imply that his mountain farm was healthy enough and rich Romans would hardly have built their villas in highly malarious regions. On the other hand, the reference to malaria in Cato shows that some parts of the country were infected quite early, and Silius Italicus, circa 25 to 101 AD, distinctly states how unhealthy were the Pomptine marshes in his time. Et quos perisfera Pomptini ulogain cambi, quae Saturnae nebulosa palis restagnant, et arto. Leventes coeno per squalidia turbidia serva. Cogit aquas, uffensetque inficit equora limo. It is clear from Horace, Saturnalius 1:5-14, Mali Culices, that this district was infected with mosquitoes. The great country houses were not always healthy, for Lucullus had a villa in a region which was probably malarious. Vitruvius, FL 15 BC, remarks that marshy districts were pestilential. Quibus autem insidious sunt paludids, et non habent publicos exitus profluences neque per flumina, neque per fossas uti pomptene stando patriscant et humores graves et pestilences inis locis immutant. Cicero mentions unhealthy districts, and a Roman army was apparently attacked by malaria in the neighbourhood of Brundusium, after spending some time in the healthy regions of Gaul and Spain. Besides these direct statements, there are frequent references to districts passing out of cultivation. Examples are Juvenal, Saturnalis 10:102, Facius Solubrius, Horace, Ep. 1, 11:7, Gabis Decitor, Lucan 7:391, and Horace Odes 2:15. How far this population was due to malaria is a difficult question to answer. Lucan lays the blame upon the great civil war between Caesar and Pompey and its continuation after the death of the former. The probability is that civil war made a district desolate, and then malaria entered and rendered it uninhabitable. Certain is that southern Latin must once have been healthy and prosperous. Later on it was a waste bog with scarcely an inhabitant. When it is remembered how easily land becomes marshy if left to itself, and how certainly mosquitoes which carry malaria will, if they have the chance, utilize these conditions to the full, the conclusion reached above is at least not unreasonable. It may then be inferred that some country districts, especially those in the modern province of Rome, were highly malarious, and that others, perhaps the majority, were comparatively healthy. Rome itself suffered from the disease in an endemic form. Celsus. It will be convenient to discuss separately the evidence of the physician Celsus. In this way it becomes plain that non-medical evidence by itself is sufficient to demonstrate how prevalent malaria was at Rome during the late Republic and the early Empire. But there is another reason why special care is necessary in dealing with this particular author. Celsus was a scientific inquirer rather than a practitioner. Law, oratory, tactics, and agriculture claimed his attention as well as medicine. His object in writing seems to have been not so much to put on record his own experience as to rescue the art from the ill repute in which it was held by the majority of the Romans. It is therefore not unlikely that no small part of his work is second-hand information borrowed from his Greek predecessors. His discussion of malaria, its symptoms, and treatment is careful and full, but it is not certain how far it proves that malaria was prevalent in Italy. Of course, the work of Celsus would have been different if malaria had not been an Italian disease, but does the extent to which malaria occupies a treatise correspond to the extent of the infection? The point may be illustrated from the history of medicine in our own country. Everybody knows how common the terms tertian aug, quartan aug, and aug used to be both in literature and the common speech, but it would be a great mistake to suppose that all these augs were malaria. Some of them certainly were, but very many, probably most, were not true tertians or quartans at all. The reason for this misuse of terms is as curious as it is important. Any reader who looks up a catalogue of the editions of Galen will be struck by the number which appeared in the 16th century, and to a less extent the 17th. Independently of this fact, it is known that Galen formed a textbook for doctors of the period, although afterwards a Hippocratic tradition grew up. Now both Galen and Hippocrates discuss intermittence more fully than other fevers. So much is this the case, that doctors trained in the ordinary medical school of the 16th century would be apt to assign a periodicity to a fever which was not really an intermittent. Creighton is very clear on this point. Aug in early English meant any sharp fever, and most commonly a continued fever. The special limitation to intermittence appears to have followed the revival of the study of the Greco-Roman writers on medicine, Galen, above all, in the 16th century. In the Tudor period, there were, in this country, actual experiences of strange fevers, which were interpreted according to the Greek teachings of quotidians, tertians, and quartians, with their several bastard or hybrid or larval forms. These, as I have said, were certainly not the endemic fever of malarious districts. It is impossible to be quite sure that something of the same kind has not caused the prominence of malaria in the treatise of Celsus. For this reason it is better to state the case for Italy without relying upon his testimony, but since non-medical evidence has shown that malaria existed and was common, the book De Medicina may be used as confirmatory evidence. The pathology of various diseases occupies the whole of the third book. Fevers are discussed in chapters 3 to 17. Of this proportion, practically the whole except chapters 7 and 9 deals with malaria. Indeed, the treatment of non-malarial fevers is slight and unsatisfactory, and tends to show either that diseases of the typhus and typhoid groups were rare in Italy, or that their symptoms have been confused, as the Greeks confused them, with those of the intermittents. Malaria is by far the most common equivalent of febris. To show this, it will only be necessary to quote the opening words of the third chapter. The next point is the healing of fevers. These both affect the whole body and form a class of disorders which are especially common. One kind is the quotidian, another is the tertian, another the quartan. Sometimes, but rarely, the periodicity exhibits a longer interval. The description of these maladies is the same as that in the Hippocratic writings, and is only interesting because it proves, unless indeed Celsus is a mere plagiarist, a most unlikely assumption, that malaria has remained as an unchanged type ever since the period when it first made its appearance in history. It will be sufficient to give a brief abstract. Quartans began with shivering, horror. Then there follows an outburst of heat. Of tertians, there are two kinds, one like the quartan in character, only exhibiting a different periodicity, the other being far more malignant. It returns every third day, but of the 48 hours it occupies, 36 more or less, so that although the fever grows lightly, it never disappears entirely. Most physicians call this the semi-tertian, immatrician. Quotidians are of various kinds. Some begin with heat, some with chill, some with shivering. Sometimes the fever disappears altogether, at other times it simply diminishes, thus giving the appearance of a continuous fever. They also differ much in severity, and occasionally the fever is high on one day but less severe on the next, or occurs at one time one day and at another on the next. Sweating often occurs at the end of the attack, but not always. More than one access, with a corresponding number of remissions, sometimes occur every day. It is interesting to note the stress laid upon the malignant tertian, semi-tertian, which Galen tells us was very prevalent in Rome. The fact that in quotidians the access sometimes ran in two series, one series occurring every third day, the other on the alternate days, seems to refer to double tertian infection. Mixed infection is also apparently implied, although it is not recognized as the true cause of certain phenomena of periodicity. The treatment of fever is much more detailed than its diagnosis. Celsus was writing in order to enhance the dignity of the science, and the Romans were always more ready to listen to anything which promised to be of practical use than to discussions of the less obvious utility. Unlike the Greeks, they did not want to be told that tertians came from yellow, quartans from black bile. Their great desire was to know a cure for both. Accordingly, Celsus gives much information as to the proper times of administering food and drink to the patient, and enters into a detailed account of the cures for semi-tertians, which are treated early, possibly because of their great malignity. For fever symptoms, chill preceding fever, shivering in fever, quotidians, tertians, quartans, two quartans, and quotidians following the quartans. Apart from the elaborate treatment, which is much fuller than that given to any other disease, there is but little that is worthy of notice for the present inquiry. The care taken in administering food and drink, and the recommendations that the patient should have exercise, if possible, when free from fever, are indications of the extreme weakness which accompanies or follows malaria. The quartan, however, serious its after effects may be, was apparently regarded as a petty ailment. See especially 3:15, Nam quartana neminem igulat. This gives some point to Juvenal's sneer at the old man with the quartan. There is a reference to the existence of fever, probably malaria, in Egypt and Asia, i.e. the Roman province, while the fact that Heraclides of Tarentum is twice mentioned seems to show he paid particular attention to malaria. If so, Tarentum and its neighbourhood may have been as badly infected as the coastline of southern Italy is now. Enlargement of the spleen is not mentioned very often in the work of Celsus. Here again the cause is to be found in the purely utilitarian object of the author. Few Romans will be interested to know that large spleens and the melancholia often occur together, but they did want to know how a large spleen might be cured, and so there is a whole chapter, 5:16, devoted to the question. It may be inferred then that Celsus was perfectly familiar with malaria, although the tradition of Greek medicine may have led him to dilate unduly upon it to the exclusion of other fevers. The utilitarian character of his treatise accounts for the few interesting remarks he makes about the origin and symptoms of the disease. Influence of malaria upon the Roman character. Modern science has pronounced with no uncertain voice its judgment upon malaria as a factor in morality. The effect of the disease on the people is to unfit them for labour, to cause loss of time, loss of money, and generally to diminish their producing powers, while at the same time the race, if left to itself, tends towards moral and physical degradation. Perhaps the most incapacitating disease to which man is liable. Now it has been shown that malaria was endemic in Rome, probably from the time of Preface and Terence. Hence it is practically certain that the city population was gradually deteriorating, but from economic causes Rome was growing more and more congested ever since the Second Punic War. The results were a sparsely populated country with a degraded rabble in the metropolis. Statesmen, perceiving the effect, but not the cause, did all they could to bring back the people to the land. But economic causes were against them. The deterioration in the national character was against them, and the continuous civil wars of the 1st century BC were against them. The wasteland increased, in spite of ineffectual attempts to reclaim it. The Roman people became a tainted and debased folk, penned up within the walls of the city. New blood was constantly being introduced during the early empire from healthier and sounder races. Lucan, Seneca, Martial, and Quintilian were all Spaniards. This fresh infusion was itself infected in time, and the Roman Empire at least fell to pieces. It is not pretended that malaria was the sole cause, but it is certain that disease gave full scope to other disintegrating factors. Every now and then the modern world is shocked by atrocities committed by white men in tropical regions. Humanity and justice seem to be forgotten. Civilization and education are powerless to prevent furious outbursts of savagery. How much of this is due to the baleful influence of malaria is known only to those who have an intimate acquaintance with the disease. Something of the same kind happened in Rome. Malaria made the Greek weak and inefficient, and turned the sterner Roman into a bloodthirsty brute. If melancholia produced crossness, atrabilis made its victims mad. The terrible pictures of life in the 1st century AD, as painted by Tacitus and Juvenal, show that Roman society was not only wicked but diseased. The extravagant cruelty, the wild desire for excitement, the absence of soberness and self-control, all point clearly to some physical defect. That malaria was endemic in Rome is an undoubted fact, and the result of several generations being subject to its influence would certainly be a change of national temper. The particular form in which the change manifested itself would depend upon the prominent national characteristics and upon environment. In Rome, all these tended to produce excited savagery. Malaria will do this now, even in the case of Europeans, and yet moderns have the advantage of the one drug, quinine, which deserves the name of specific, inasmuch as it alone can be relied upon to cure the disease for which it is a remedy. Surely in ancient times, when no specific was known, the disease must have produced far more dreadful results than it does now. The writer's task is now concluded. One object has been before him throughout, to encourage a more thorough investigation into those diseases which, instead of acting as nature's pruning hooks, sap a people's strength and ruin its character. It is a task which concerns our own nation very nearly. In many of the British possessions, notably India, malaria is an ever-present enemy. Within our own shores there is to be found an endemic disease, which, though perhaps less distressing to the individual, may be equally fatal to the race when a few more generations have come and gone. For it must be remembered that the effect of a disease are often greatly increased by the mode of life and the general environment of its victims. The whole tendency of modern life, with its excitement, high pressure, intellectual strain, even its adulterated foods, is an encouragement to influenza to exact its penalty to the utmost. Often epidemic in the past, and now appears to be endemic. The strain it puts upon the nervous system is a commonplace. Whether it is fated to cause deterioration of the race is a question which only the future can decide. Be this as it may, at any rate, there is food for thought in the possibility that it was an unostentatious melody which dimmed the blaze of glory that shines round early Greece, until it finally fades away into the dark degradation of Hellenistic times. End of section 3. Section 4 of Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by William Henry Samuel Jones, Ronald Ross et al. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 4. Conclusion, by G. Eliot, M.P. The decline and ultimate downfall of a great nation form a theme at once so tragic and full of interest that it must not be lightly passed by. Down through the history of the world, nations have risen and fallen. Empires have grown and attained such extent of territory and power that it has seemed that they must be unassailable. But then has come the fall, not always suddenly and swiftly, but as if it were by the agency of some slow disease undermining the whole vital and moral power of the nation. Broadly speaking, it may be said that a nation's prosperity is measured by the social and commercial morality of her citizens, and no nation can long continue to prosper economically whose standard of morality is declining. Between the years 500 BC and 300 BC, there had come over Greece a great change, which has as yet been insufficiently explained. There is no doubt that between these years the whole moral tenor of Greece, and more especially of Athens, degenerated. This had been raised to a very high pitch of excellence. Art and philosophy both reached a standard which the world, though it may have equalled, has never surpassed. In the year 450 BC, the citizens of the various city-states of Greece were manly, patriotic, and religious. They were brought up to, and was their pride to maintain, that ideal of citizenship which demanded of every individual that he should willingly perform his allotted part in upholding the honour of the state, whether as magistrate or as soldier or in some less conspicuous capacity. After that year, a change set in. This change was not indicated by an increase in morality, but the virtues of courage and patriotism, which had up till then dominated in the Greek character, gave way to a sentimentalism, a kindness and domesticity, which eventually proved disastrous. For though it may appear that these characteristics are not such as to encompass the downfall of a nation nowadays, it must be remembered that at the time when the Greek states were declining, the small and weakly nation was not protected from the strong and powerful neighbour by any consideration of international self-respect on the part of the latter. Nay, rather was a nation's self-respect, and that in which she was held by her neighbours, in direct proportion to her strength and her preparedness to repel the attacks of those neighbours. There must have been, then, some agent which in the 4th century BC was at work on the character of the Greeks, causing them to give up their belief in religion, in a future life, and the value of patriotism. For these changes undoubtedly occurred, and were as undoubtedly largely instrumental in bringing about the decline of the Greek nation. The day is long past when such changes could be accepted as the inevitable and inscrutable workings of Providence, into which even it would not only be useless, but even wicked and dangerous to probe. What then was that agent? The Greek writers, medical and non-medical, make frequent mention of fevers, and perhaps there is no word which is being used so indiscriminately or with such indefinite and varied meaning as the word fever. Even today, in England, the term is employed with the utmost looseness, and is applied to nearly every disease contracted beyond the bounds of our sea-girt isle. In the foregoing pages, the various words used by the Greek authors to indicate fever have been critically examined and compared, and it has been noted that the word paretos was from the year 400 BC somewhat restricted in its sense and applied to all events by some authors, chiefly to those fevers which were distinguished by a periodicity of access. Now there exists very little doubt that by far the most common of that category of diseases which is designated by the word fever is malaria. This disease, which has within the last 2 decades been so thoroughly investigated, has an enormous area of distribution. That it is endemic in many parts of Greece is well known. Hirsch says, as regards Greece, we are assured of the endemic occurrence of malarial disease at many points in Boeotia and Attica, Livadia, Locris, the swampy shores of Lake Toparis, Thebes, the country road, Athens, Zaitouni, Norpentos, and Vonitsa, Acarnania, and Aetolia, at Challis, in Euboea, in the Peloponnese at Corinth and neighborhood, Vostiza, the ancient Aegean, Tropolitsa, Mistra, Navarino, Modon, and many other places on the coast. In Crete, endemic malaria is very common, as it is also in several of the Ionian islands, particularly Cephalonia, St. Moria, and Corfu, and quite recently the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine has been carrying out an inquiry into the disease in Greece, and a league has been founded to combat it. It seems then that while the Greeks, like all other nations, were attacked by sharp epidemics of a deadly nature, such as the plague of Athens, there were known to them, and were described by their medical writers, other diseases of a less fatal nature, which were more or less constantly present, and which were designated fevers. And moreover, among these fevers were recognized some types having a marked and regular periodicity of attack. There is a distinct difference noted between the plague and the fevers. Galen, in his commentary on Hippocrates, explains the plague as an epidemical fever of a fatal nature. Thucydides, in his description of the plague of Athens, mentions that the disease was very acute, with much vomiting of bile, and towards the end diarrhea, ulceration of the bowels, and various symptoms of putrefaction. The transient character of the plague was well known, and its advent was believed to be connected with the appearance of extraordinary phenomena in earth and sky. From Thucydides downwards, most Greek writers, medical and non-medical, who make mention of the plague, draw attention to its contagiousness, while Alexander Aphrodisiensis goes so far as to say that pestilential fevers are contagious, but common fevers not so. There is no doubt then that the Greeks were perfectly able to discriminate between the plague, which seems, from the symptoms mentioned, to have been some type of intestinal disease, and the intermittent fevers, which were more commonly present and less fatal, and which were looked upon with a degree of toleration, to which perhaps a parallel may be found in the way in which, some 2,000 years after, an epidemic of influenza is regarded in the present day compared with an epidemic of typhoid fever or of smallpox. Now in the foregoing pages, reference has been made to various passages from the Greek medical writers, and not a few from the non-medical authors, to show that the Greeks were well acquainted with intermittent fevers, which they called quartans and tertians, tetartias, tritatoi, and the references given above to Galen's works, Perityphon and Periperizon, prove almost beyond a doubt that Galen, as also his predecessor, from whom he quoted largely, had acquired a knowledge of the various types of intermittent fevers, such as could only be gained from an extensive acquaintance with this type of disease. And Galen, be it remembered, besides being skilled in all the sciences of his day, was a most accomplished clinician. He, like his prototype and model, the great master of medicine, Hippocrates, belonged to the rational sect, who looked upon disease and its treatment from the broadest point of view, and availed themselves of the knowledge to be gained from a close study of the causes of disease. It seems therefore legitimate to conclude that the intermittent fevers, the quotidians, tertians, and quartans, were a frequent occurrence among the ancient Greeks, and this view is rendered more probable by the following facts. Splenic enlargement is frequently mentioned by Hippocrates and other medical writers, and a syndrome of symptoms is mentioned as being very commonly met with, which bears an undoubted resemblance to the symptoms of malarial cachexia. And this splenic enlargement, which was of common occurrence, is greatly in favour of a prevalence of malaria in Greece, both before and during the time when Hippocrates lived and wrote. For although the spleen becomes enlarged through other causes, and notably during an attack of typhoid fever, it is to be remembered that the typhoidal spleen usually resumes its normal size on the subsidence of the fever, whereas the malarial spleen most frequently remains enlarged for years. This is due, no doubt, to the length of time that the malarial parasite remains domiciled in its human host. It is possible, too, that the frequency with which the votive offerings of the Greeks, after illness, took the form of a representation of the abdomen is due to the splenic enlargement. It may be so, and undoubtedly the malarial spleen, which not infrequently reaches the weight of 70 or 80 ounces, a normal spleen weighs 5 to 7 ounces, would be very noticeable, and the consequent enlargement of the abdomen would most certainly make a great impression on the non-medical mind. Now, there is very little doubt that Greece does at the present time afford excellent soil for the growth of the malarial mosquito, and this is largely due to the configuration of the country. As is known, Greece is a very mountainous country, but between the mountains are numerous small valleys with abundance of stagnant water during certain parts of the year. One of these valleys, that of Lake Copais, has been visited and examined by Major Ross, who has found malaria very prevalent and of a very severe type, especially among the children. Infecting the child 1 or 2 years after birth, it persecutes him until puberty with a long succession of febrile attacks, accompanied by much splenomegaly and anemia. In these words does Major Ross talk of the scourge which at present undermines the whole of the life of Greece, and he asks what must be the effect of this ubiquitous and everlasting incubus of disease on the people of modern Greece. What indeed? For it would seem that this disease, with its constant drain upon the resources of the growing body, must put a check upon the development, physical and mental, of each successive rising generation. Viewed from an entirely medical standpoint, the question can admit of no doubt. The succession of febrile attacks would alone be a serious tax upon the growing child, or the consequent anemia which so soon makes its appearance, at a time of great educational importance, must make the child incapable of prolonged application, and rob him to a large extent of his powers of mental receptivity. It is only too evident that in a few generations a type of man possessing extraordinary mental and physical powers may become under this scourge of malaria greatly altered and debased. If it be that the malarial parasite was introduced into Greece during the 5th century BC, it is quite possible for the disease, running a practically unchecked course, to have produced the profound deterioration which occurred in the Greek character during the next century and a half. Mention has already been made of the enlarged spleen and the anemia, which are so often the results of repeated malarial attacks. The anemia is frequently very extreme, the red blood cells being reduced to 1/4 their normal number. In addition to this, there may be quickened respiratory movements. The heart's action may be weak, and the pulse weak, while such may be the general condition of the tissues that the slightest wound may become gangrenous. Dropsy, diarrhea, vomiting, loss of appetite, and all kinds of neuralgic and muscular pains are some of the troubles to which the subjects of chronic malaria are liable. They are too more susceptible to any other infections with which they come in contact. It appears from a study of the foregoing pages highly probable that malaria was introduced into Greece during the 5th century BC. It is well known that malaria, when introduced into a new region, which it finds suitable to its growth, will make very rapid and very serious ravages among the inhabitants of that region, especially in the absence of prophylaxis. But prophylaxis, as is known today, was not practiced in the 5th century BC, and it seems legitimate to conclude that the malaria probably ran a more or less unchecked course among the Greeks. Such a course, in fact, as would be liable to carry in its train all the more serious consequences of the disease which have been recounted above. And a perusal of these consequences will not leave the reader any doubt that in a very few generations such influences must, both by transmitted hereditary diathesis and by direct infection of the children, have very marked and very painful effects upon the physical and mental powers of a nation. The moral effects of disease are felt in several ways. A sharp epidemic with an accompanying high mortality has a very different moral effect upon a people to that produced by a disease which has changed its character from epidemic to endemic. Such a scene, for instance, as was presented in Europe during the 14th century by the Brotherhood of Flagellants, due undoubtedly to the reaction of fear upon the minds of people who were both ignorant and superstitious, was only likely to be caused by a sharp and fatal epidemic, such as was the Black Death in that century. And it must be remembered, in assigning its proper value from a modern standpoint to that and like episodes, that imagination which played so prominent a part in the life and thought of the ancients has to a large extent been destroyed by the flood of materialization in which the superstitions of the past have been buried. But a temporary state of frenzy following on an epidemic of a malignant nature is not likely to cause any permanent degeneration in the physical and mental characteristics of the nation attacked. Besides, be it remembered, the ancient Greeks, though highly imaginative, were not superstitious to the same degree and the same sense as were the people of the Middle Ages. It is a disease which is only slightly fatal, and on that account perhaps somewhat neglected, which will exert its harmful effects upon individuals, and through them insidiously upon the life and energies of the state which is peopled by these individuals. And especially will a disease which leaves serious after effects tend to act thus. For the individual may be weakened by the hereditary transmission of the morbid taint from his parents or by actual infection after birth. He may suffer from an inherited diathesis, or he may acquire some definite pathological changes in his tissues from direct infection. And this pernicious process, carried on practically unchecked for a generation or two, must tend to produce a type of man very inferior to the original. Is there then any example of disease at the present time which, having become practically endemic, causes serious after effects, though the primary infection itself is but rarely fatal? No one today is unacquainted with the very serious conditions produced by the various sequelae of influenza. Many and strange they are, and they attack nearly every system of the human body. Perhaps the post-influenzal state has been best described by Dr. Gowers, quoted by Professor Clifford Allbott. It is an intense feeling of inertia. Every action, physical and mental, requires an effort of the will to initiate and maintain it that is almost painful. Immobility of mind and body alone seem possible, and yet even rest has to be endured, for it brings no freedom from the sense of prostration. So strange and unfamiliar is a state that it seems at first as if it would only be transient and would be gone tomorrow. But the mistake is realized when day after day, week after week passes without relief. In perhaps the majority, it is only after some months that the natural freedom of untrammeled effort is regained. This is no exaggeration, and to descend to details, influenza is a more prolific producer than any other infection of hypochondriasis, mental aberration, melancholia, mania, and general paralysis. Neuralgia, neuritis, and many other degenerations, temporary and permanent, have followed influenza, and many signs of disturbed nerve centers have persisted long after the initial infection has disappeared. Hirsch says that the geographical distribution of influenza extends, without doubt, over the whole inhabited globe, and he questions the endemicity of influenza in certain countries situated in the cold zone. But it is generally agreed that the epidemic of 1889-90, as well as former epidemics, had its origin in Russia, whence in a few months it had spread westward across Europe, finally reaching North America, and only attacking tropical countries late in its course, when it had exhausted the countries of the cold zone. This disease had been dealt with at some length, because the writer has wished, using it as an example, to emphasize the manner in which such a disease, which has almost established for itself the character of endemicity by the serious after effects which it causes, may in time bring about moral and physical degeneration in the inhabitants of a country. Although but few fatal issues are recorded from the disease itself, and it is in consequence of this very fact regarded with considerable toleration. Now, the geographical distribution of endemic malaria may be roughly said to include all tropical and subtropical countries. Covering a broad area on either side of the equator, malaria continues to be endemic for some distance into the temperate zone, its frequency and severity diminishing towards the higher latitudes. In Europe, England, France, and Germany are the countries most exempt from malaria. In Africa, the disease is very widespread and very severe, South Africa, comprising Cape Colony, Orange River Colony, the Transvaal, Natal and Rhodesia, is that part in which the disease is least prevalent. Throughout the continent of Asia, malaria has long been endemic, with the exception of the group of islands forming Japan. Here the disease is very rare, and when it does occur, it is mild in type. Australia and New Zealand, in fact all Oceania, enjoy a marked immunity from malaria. In the Western Hemisphere, malaria is very severe in the West Indies, the east coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and in Brazil. In southern Brazil, however, Uruguay, and some parts of the Argentine Republic, there is a comparative immunity from the disease. The Pacific coast of Central America and Mexico enjoy a large degree of freedom from malaria than do the coasts facing the Atlantic Ocean. In North America, in general terms, the disease may be said to be endemic in the southern states, decreasing both in frequency and severity northwards, so that the endemic malaria is practically unknown in Canada, though, as an epidemic disease, it has on rare occasions made its appearance. Perhaps the most striking fact in the light of recent events, which this brief and rough sketch of the topography of endemic malaria brings out, is the almost absolute immunity of Japan. It is no place here to discuss the probable reasons for Japan's somewhat sudden leap into the position of a first-rate power. Suffice it that she has assumed that position and shows every prospect of maintaining it, and the most prejudicial observer will be bound to admit that the Japanese have displayed a patriotism and fearlessness such as was displayed by the Greeks at the height of their military and naval glory before the moral decline, which ultimately proved their ruin, had as yet set its mark upon them. It may be objected that it is unfair to argue from the cause of one small portion of the globe, but the case of Japan is so very striking, more especially when looked at in contrast with her gigantic but unprogressive neighbour China, where malaria of a very severe type is constantly present. But in the other countries there is no lack of evidence that the districts and countries which enjoy a total or partial immunity from malaria are those whose inhabitants today exhibit the greatest activity. For has not South America fallen far behind North America? And Spain, which once bid fair to be the mistress of all Europe, nay of all the known world, has fallen from her high estate, and has for long years been unable to keep pace with the more northern countries of Europe. And lastly, what in contrast is there between the malarial and non-malarial parts of Africa, between South Africa and the West and Central Africa? End of section 4. And end of Malaria, a neglected factor in the history of Greece and Rome, by William Henry Samuel Jones, Ronald Ross, and G.G. Elliott. Recorded by Leon Harvey for LibriVox.org.